The year is 1453. Deep within the stone belly of Constantinople, the air is not filled with the fresh salt of the Bosphorus, but with the suffocating weight of frankincense and the stale heat of 1,000 desperate breaths. A low drone of Greek prayers fills the convent, a desperate chorus meant to build a wall that stone and mortar could not. But the sanctity of the altar offers no silence. Listen closely. Beyond the thick limestone walls, the world is ending. It begins as a vibration in the floorboards, growing into the rhythmic, subterranean thud of the Janissary drums. Thump, thump, thump. It is not the music of men. It is the heartbeat of a wolf circling the fold. In the center of the nave, a young novice kneels on the cold flagstones. Focus on her hands. They are pale, white-knuckled, and trembling so violently that the wooden beads of her rosary click together. Click, click, click. It is a frantic, skeletal rhythm, a tiny sound of terror trying to be heard over the screech of Ottoman cannons tearing the sky apart. Beside her, a single tallow candle sputters as the earth shakes, the flame gasping for oxygen, threatening to surrender to the encroaching shadow. They prayed for salvation, but the only answer they received was the sound of iron breaking down the gates. To understand the terror freezing the blood of those women, you must understand the storm gathering outside. The Ottoman Empire was not merely an army. It was a rising tide of iron that had swallowed kingdoms whole. At its vanguard stood the Janissaries. They did not move with the chaotic fervor of a mob, but with the terrifying silent discipline of a predatory machine. Whether it was the great walls of Constantinople in 1453 or the coastal defenses of Otranto, the objective was the same. This was a war of the crescent against the cross. To the commanders gazing upon the spires of the city, these were not just territories to be mapped, they were altars to be overturned. And for the convents nestled within these walls, the holy ground offered no sanctuary. In the eyes of the invaders, the veil did not protect, it advertised. The women praying in the dark were not seen as brides of Christ, but as currency. They were living spoils, destined not for martyrdom, but for the slave markets of the East. Gold to be weighed, traded, and carried away into a life where their names would be forgotten. The walls of the city had stood for 1,000 years, but against the thirst of the Sultan's army, stone was no stronger than paper. Inside the main chapel, the flock gathered. Hundreds of women, shrouded in black and white, pressed together beneath the vaulted ceilings, seeking the warmth of the herd. They clung to a desperate ancient delusion, the belief that their spiritual veil offered a physical immunity. They whispered to one another that there were lines even monsters would not cross, that the wrath of the heavens would strike down any hand raised against a bride of God. The heavy oak doors were slammed shut. The great iron bar was slid into place with a resounding clang, a sound that was meant to signal safety, but echoed like the closing of a cell. They looked to the altar, believing the sanctity of the space was a shield that steel could not penetrate. The air in the nave grew thick, a suffocating mixture of sweet frankincense and the sour, metallic scent of cold sweat. The elders moved among the weeping novices, their voices low and steady, promising that the eyes of the Lord were upon them. They were right, of course. But they forgot that the eyes of the wolf were watching too, waiting for the gate to splinter. They believed their faith was a fortress, not realizing they had simply trapped themselves inside a tomb. The end did not come with a knock. It came with the violent shattering of the world. The great oak doors, barred with iron and prayer, groaned under the assault before finally exploding inward. A blinding wedge of daylight pierced the sacred gloom, swirling with choking dust and flying splinters, a tear in the veil between the holy and the profane. Through the haze, the silhouettes stepped through. Armored men, smelling of sweat and gunpowder, placed their heavy boots onto the consecrated marble. The violation was absolute. In an instant, the drone of the chant was severed. The air was stripped of prayer, leaving a vacuum that was filled not by a battle cry, but by a collective suffocating gasp. Then came the sound of the occupation, the heavy rhythmic clatter of metal on stone, and the scraping of scabbards against the pews. The soldiers paused, their eyes adjusting to the dim candlelight. They did not raise their swords to strike. Instead, they scanned the huddling mass of women with the cold, predatory calculation of wolves surveying a trap. They did not see nuns. They saw youth. They saw beauty. And they saw gold. The terror that washed over the room was not the fear of death, but the dawn of a far darker realization. To these men, they were no longer souls to be saved, but inventory to be claimed. When the sanctity of the church was broken, the silence of prayer was replaced by a scream that history has tried to forget. To the faithful, the sword is a kindness. It offers an end, a gateway to the paradise they have spent a lifetime praying for. But these women faced a terror far deeper than the blade. They faced the slow, suffocating erasure of the soul. From the sanctuary, they were herded like cattle onto the dusty roads, bound for the coast. The horror began with the dismantling of the self. The black veils, the white wimples, the heavy crucifixes. These were not merely garments to be stripped away. They were a second skin. As the rough hands of the captors tore these sacred shrouds apart, they were not just exposing flesh. They were peeling away identity, leaving the spirit naked to the profane gaze of the auction block. They were loaded onto ships that cut through the waves, carrying them further from God's altar and closer to the abyss. They vanished into the teeming markets of Bursa, Edirne, and Algiers. There, the red martyrdom, the spilling of blood for Christ, was denied to them. Instead, they were forced to endure a white martyrdom of a different kind, a living burial. In the gilded cages of the Ottoman elite, they ceased to exist. Their Christian names were scrubbed from the record, replaced by foreign titles that meant nothing to them. The bride of Christ was forced to become the concubine of a master, a spiritual execution played out over decades of silence. They were not granted the mercy of a quick death. Instead, they were dragged into the darkness of the harem, where their names, their vows, and their voices were extinguished forever. Not every lamb went silently to the slaughter. In the chaos of the breach, a terrible clarity descended upon the sisters. They understood the mathematics of the conqueror. Beauty equaled value, and value equaled a lifetime of servitude. To deny the enemy their prize, they had to destroy the vessel. For some, salvation lay in the abyss. They ran not away from the danger, but toward the edges of the world, the high parapets of the city walls, or the deep, stagnant mouths of the courtyard wells. They did not see a fall. They saw an ascension. They cast themselves into the air, choosing the cold embrace of the earth over the warm, suffocating grip of a master. Others turned their resistance inward. Realizing that their faces were the currency of their doom, they took up jagged shards of pottery or the sharp edges of broken glass. With steady hands, they marred the very beauty the invaders sought to harvest. They carved ruin into their own skin, transforming themselves from prized jewels into damaged goods, worthless to the auctioneer, but sanctified in the eyes of God. And in the heart of the chapel, the elders refused to rise. They knelt before the altar, their fingers locked around the base of the crucifix with a grip of iron. They became part of the stone, immovable statues of faith. The soldiers could not drag them away. They had to strike them down where they knelt. Their blood washed over the marble, not as a sign of defeat, but as a final, permanent seal upon their vows. In their final moments, they proved that while the body can be captured, the soul can only be surrendered, and they refused to let go. Then, as quickly as the storm had broken the world, the tide rolled out. The screaming stopped. The clash of steel faded into the distance, following the army deeper into the city. What remained was not peace, but a silence so profound it felt heavy, a vacuum where the soul of the building had been ripped away. The convent was empty. The great stone halls, which had held the breath of prayer for centuries, were now just cold masonry. The floor was a graveyard of small, tragic artifacts. A torn black veil caught on the jagged edge of a splintered pew fluttered in the draft like the broken wing of a crow. A leather-bound Bible lay open in the mud, its pages trampled by the indifference of a muddy boot. And on the floor, the single candle that had flickered in the novice's hand was now extinguished, a cold puddle of wax hardening on the stone. The erasure was immediate. Before the sun had even set on the conquest, the transformation began. The sacred vessels were melted down. The frescoes, staring down with the eyes of saints, were whitewashed into oblivion. The nave, once the house of the bridegroom, was repurposed as a stable for the cavalry. The sound of the choir was replaced by the restless snorting of horses and the clatter of fodder buckets. The memory of the women was not just stolen, it was paved over. The incense smoke cleared, leaving only the scent of iron and the echo of prayers that went unanswered. For 500 years, their story was thought to be lost, erased by the whitewash on the walls. But history has a way of speaking from the grave. In recent excavations beneath the old quarter of Istanbul, archaeologists uncovered a section of plaster that had peeled away from a basement wall. Underneath the Ottoman paint, scratched desperately into the stone with something sharp, perhaps a hairpin or a broken nail, were faint Latin letters. They did not ask for help. They did not curse their captors. The inscription simply read, Timor Domini, the fear of the Lord. It trails off, unfinished. A final, silent testament from a woman who knew her world was ending, but refused to let her faith die without a witness. They whitewashed the walls to hide the truth, but they could not scrub the prayer out of the stone. The horror did not end when the ships left the harbor. The fall of the convents was a wound that refused to close, a trauma that seeped into the soil of the West. For centuries, the Ottoman peril was not merely a political threat. It was a phantom that haunted the collective nightmare of Europe. It was the fear that the light of their world could be snuffed out by a wind blowing from the east, that the sanctity of their homes was only ever one broken gate away from oblivion. But in the grand tapestry of empires rising and falling, it is easy to lose the thread of the individual. We speak of the Fall of Constantinople or the Sack of Otranto as if they were merely movements on a map. We forget that history is written in the blood of those who had no say in the writing. These women who had names, who had favorite prayers, who had fears and dreams, were reduced to ghostly footnotes, swept away by the indifference of time. The ruins of the convents stand today as silent witnesses, crumbling monuments to a terrifying truth. They remind us that the veneer of civilization is paper thin, and that the distance between the holy and the profaned is measured only by the strength of a hinge. We build stone walls to stop armies, but history has taught us that stone cannot stop hatred, and it certainly cannot protect innocence.